So that's just a short intro. And you can read through. It needs sound, right? So next time I have to add sound to it. So. All right, here we go. So welcome to my session about JavaFX. May the 4th be with you. My name is Gerrit Grunwald. I'm working for Azul Systems as a developer advocate. And this session is only about JavaFX. And I'm glad that a few people showed up because it's not that stuff that is so famous at the moment, but it's still in use. Yeah, let me start with that. So diabetes sucks. I have to say that because my son has diabetes type 1. And because of that, we have to monitor him 24/7. So he has a sensor and get the data and all that stuff. And because of that, our house is cluttered with all these different devices that show his blood glucose values, right? So no worries, you don't have to be into diabetes to understand that. It's just the background because this is the reason why I built all that stuff. We have to monitor our son. So I built these devices that you see on the lower left, and I have an app for macOS and for iOS, and with the watch app and all these things, and there's many, many more. And there's also a desktop app, and I wrote that in Swift. The reason for that is that I started with one for iOS, and you can run iOS applications on macOS, but then you can't use stuff like the tray icon. So what I needed to do was to create the app again for macOS specific, and it has some specific features like, for example, it shows the current value, it shows the history, that is the graph, it shows some last 30-day values and also pattern of the last week as a chart, and it shows the time in range. That means there's a specific range of the blood glucose you have to be in, then it's good. If you are too high, it's bad. If you are too low, it can really be dangerous, which is the main reason we do all that. And it has settings, of course, it has features like it can talk to you and speak the value, and it can send notifications and all these kind of things you can set up. And it has a system tray icon. So if you are on Mac, who's on Mac here? Who has a Mac? Okay, a few. So on Mac, it's possible to have in the tray icon, for example, text. So in this application, when I start up the computer, and it just gets the values and it shows it always in the tray icon. So I can just see there how the actual value is. So and the main question was, can I do this application in JavaFX? Is that possible with all the features? So for that, we have to take a look at the native looking Windows, which is, it should be no big deal, you think, but it is a little bit different. Usually, if you have Windows, then they have a title, they have buttons for minimize, maximize, and all these kind of things, close. They are resizable, they are draggable, you can drag windows around. And on Mac, they have rounded corners. This is the first thing, which is different from, for example, Windows, where you have just square corners. They support dark and light themes, which is also not always usual to have. For example, on Linux, you can also set it in some distributions, not in everyone. And they have tool buttons and text fields in the window header. This is also a little bit special. So this is a typical macOS window. You have this close, minimize, maximize button, you have the title, you have the rounded corners, that's all good, but we also have this kind of windows. And you see the header is bigger, is higher, and it has buttons in there, it has text fields in there, and a usual JavaFX application don't support this. So you can't do, not with the standard. So this is something you have to build on your own. And so let's give it a try in CSS. If we can do that, first of all, the window at all, if we can shape something like this in CSS, in JavaFX. Especially, you see, this is just zoomed in, you see the rounded corners. It's not just one color, it's 4 colors, just for the header. You can't really see it here on this image, but if you really zoom in further, then you can see it's a gradient, different colors and all that kind of stuff. So first of all, the layout of this window is a border pane, and on top of the border pane we put an anchor pane, and in the anchor pane we put an H box, In the H box, we put 3 circles. So this is in principle the layout of this window. And because on top we have the anchor pane, you can imagine if we can have one H box for the circles, we could have also add buttons and whatever we need, text fields and so on. And in the center of the border pane, we just put whatever, a region. The whole main thing is in the center of that. So let's take a look at the design of the header. So we have to measure the corner radius, we have to measure the height, we have to pick all the colors, and you see it's really 4 different colors that you see on the right side. And there's also this tiny little drop shadow on the header that falls onto the main body of the application. In macOS, this is all very well designed, and you just take that for granted, but if you really take a close look, you see how much effort they spent on doing all this UI stuff, which makes it not even easy to copy that, right? So let's take a look. First of all, a little tip, you should always look for a good screenshot tool and also a color picker. That it's really useful if you work in the UI business. I always have a color picker where I can just pick all these colors that, for example, from this window, because otherwise there's no chance to get the real colors. And it also depends on the screen. And there are other things like on macOS, the windows are not really semi-transparent, but they are transparent somehow. And that means that if you have a dark window below, then the whole header is darker. If you have a light window below, it's a little bit brighter. So that's really tricky. but this is not covered by my window. Here you see, for example, I zoomed in, and on the left side you see just the CSS code that is needed to design this kind of header. So first of all, we define and fix the height. It's the 52.5. And by doing this in CSS, if you set min, max, and pref height, it's fixed. So no layout container will change it. So it will always stay at that size. And it's only the height because the width is variable, right? Then we have the background insets. And I told you it's 4 layers. And you see the first one is 0. And then we have insets by half a point. And then another one and another one. So this are the 4 layers. So because they are really, you have to think about with the insets, who's familiar with JavaFX CSS stuff? Just 1, 2, 3, okay. Because this is a little bit tricky in the beginning, if you have no idea about CSS, then you really have to learn that the insets define more or less the layers that you can stack on top, and then for the background colors, you can do the same. For each of these layers, you can define a color. That's what we do with the FX background color. And also for the radius of the corners, for each layer, you can define the radius. And by the radius, you have to really keep in mind that you can't use the same radius for each inset because that doesn't really look right. So they change, right? If it's smaller, the radius should also be smaller. So this is something you see here in this FX background radius. You can see that the outer one has 10 pixels radius, and then it's 9.5, and then it's 8.5. So it changed, right? So you really have to play around with that to make it look correct. And if we take a look at the colors, you see that the first color, the outer layer, is nearly black. It's this RGB 222. And then the second one is linear gradient. And the idea is here to have, if you take a look at the windows, it looks like on top of the window is like a little highlight. So, and this is exactly this linear gradient. So it goes from a brighter gray to a darker gray, and that gives you in the end this effect as if it was really a little bit stick out of the window. The code for that header is pretty simple. It's exactly like the layout that I said. So we define an anchor pane, and then we define, this is the header, and then we define a border pane, and then we put just this anchor pane in the top of the border pane, and then on the right side we see the result. This is really just the header. You see the window, this is the JavaFX application on the lower right, and this is really just the header inside. That's the first start, and this is all the code that you need. So you need this CSS to do it, and you need that code to run the application. Well, this is pretty simple. For the body, it's the same thing. You zoom in, you pick the colors and the radius, and then you can create that stuff. And it ends up with a style class. I named it body. Again, we have the insets, the radius, the color, and then on the right side, you see how it looks like. And if we put that together, then you see on the left side the code, and on the right side the CSS. This is really all you need to get to this result. So this is in principle the frame of our window. So this will be our window in the end. But it's still, at the moment, it's just a layout container within a window. You see the original JavaFX application window where it says header demo. So then we have these 3 buttons. And the simplest thing to do here is just to use circles, right? Because in JavaFX we have the circle, which is something you can directly use as a shape. So we just need to know what is the position of each of these circles, what is the distance between them, what is the radius, and what are the colors and all that. And again, it's not a flat color. This is really tricky. In macOS, it's defined like that. If you have the dark theme, then it's the main color of the circle, and it has a border around it which is brighter. If you have the bright theme, then the border around it is darker. So this is all defined in the UI guides of Apple. And if you take a look at that, it's really interesting how much effort they spend on these kind of things. So like I said, I picked the colors, the distance, and all that. And then I just created a class which extends circle, because I need these different circle classes like the green, the yellow, and the red, and the gray. So I just created an enum within this class, which is just close, minimize, maximize. And then in the constructor, I just set the radius by 6, and then the style class dependent on the type of the circle. That's all we need. And on the right side, we see the CSS for each of these buttons. There's a class for close, minimize, maximize, and then I have for all of these a disabled state, which is just the gray one. And you see I have a fill and I have a stroke. And this is just the simplest version, because I also have some CSS where it's, you have a pseudo class for dark. If it goes to dark mode, then you can have to adjust all the colors for dark. And in the end, if I do that, if I add these buttons to the whole window, then you get the result on the right side, which is not too bad. It's at least, on the left you see the original window, that's the Swift window, and on the right you see the JavaFX window. Okay, that's cool, but it's still inside of a window, right? This is not really now a standalone window. So if you would like to do that, you have to set the stage in its style to transparent. The problem with this is that in JavaFX, the stage gives you all the stuff like resizing, like dragging, and all that, right? If it's disabled, the stage will disable all the controls in it and all these kind of things. If you disable it like this with stage style transparent, that's all gone. That means it's really your job to do that. You have to take care about resizing, dragging, disable, enable, all these kind of things you have to implement on your own. And that's a little bit tricky. And I have to be honest, it's not good for the performance if you don't do it right. So you can get into trouble if you don't do it right, because you add listeners and all that stuff to this layout container, and that could be slow. Just keep that in mind. And I told you there's this shadow, right, below the header. And there's an interesting thing that I stumbled upon, so let me give you some tips about shadows in JavaFX. If you would like to do drop shadows in layouts, then like this, for example, right? This is our example. We have the anchor pane on top, we have the region in the center, and we would like to have a shadow on the anchor pane that should fall onto the region at the bottom. This is more or less the same code on all of these windows. I don't know if you can see the shadows on the right side, both windows on the right side, they have the drop shadow, and the left ones don't have the drop shadow. And in principle, this is exactly the same code. And I was wondering, why is this freaking shadow not visible? And the main reason for that is, it's the order, and it makes sense. The order how you add the stuff to the scene graph. Because you can imagine, if you would like to have the shadow should fall onto the body, means if you add the header first, and then you add the body, then the shadow is below the body. So the solution is, you have to really keep in mind what is on top, and then the shadow can really fall below. This is really, really interesting, and this is just an example for a border pane, where you have to set the center first and then the top, to make sure that the header really has the shadow. And because I thought there's something wrong with the code, and then I realized, okay, it's really the order of the elements within the scene graph. That's important. You have to keep that in mind if you work with shadows. So always really think about the physical stuff. If it's on top, it should be on top in the scene graph. So and that can lead to the fact that you have to add the header as the last thing, right? And the same goes for the anchor pane, right? So you see I add the content first and then the header, and that leads to the fact that I have the shadow visible. If you would like to have drop shadows on windows, it's a different story. Because in this case, for example, we said we just disabled the stage, right? And that means if I now add a shadow to this border pane, you won't see it really. Because there's no space where the shadow can be drawn. So that if I do it like that, I just use my border pane, have the header on top, have the region in the center, and then I say to the whole thing, it should have a drop shadow that falls on the background of the desktop, for example. Then there's simply no space to draw the shadow. Even if you add it, you won't see it. That means what we have to do here, we have to add another region just to have space to draw the shadow, right? So as you can see, you put the whole window in a region and make the region transparent, and then the shadow can fall and spread out. And this is another problem, right? Because you can imagine if I do that, then my whole stage, which is transparent, now also includes the transparent region which holds the shadow. If you add a drag and drop, or let's say a drag listener for the mouse, then it will not really act on the actual visible window, but it will act on the shadow. So you have to keep that in mind. That's what I mean. If you really have to create this whole stage on your own, you have to keep all these things in mind. So this is a little bit tricky, but you can do it. So we will come to that later. Yeah, you have to keep the region transparent, set some padding. You see, I only set the padding on the left, right, and on the bottom, because on top we don't need really space for a shadow. And then in the end, we add the border pane to the region, and then we apply the shadow to the border pane, and it will fall on the region. And the region is transparent, so it will just show up on the final application. This is all these things that people just get wrong when they start with JavaFX and they read, oh, it's so cool, I have drop shadows here, and they use this stuff, and then it doesn't work. So what's wrong? Because this is not really explained somewhere. You just have to know that it's really like physical. If you put something on the table, then the shadow will fall on the table. But if I put something on that, then the shadow is gone, right? Because it's covered. So this is the same in the scene graph. The order really matters here. Okay, but back to the buttons. Because that was just the simple one to draw buttons, but these are actual buttons. That means they have some functionality. If you hover them, then suddenly there appear some symbols like this cross or this minus. So we also should take this into account. And there's something in JavaFX that you can use is SVG. Did someone use that here? SVG in JavaFX? You should give it a try because it's really powerful. This is the actual implementation, right? I just extended circle and give it a color and a stroke, and that's it. So there's no symbol at all. To make that possible, instead of extending the circle, we just extend the stack pane. You might want to ask yourself, so okay, but the stack pane is not round, but we can do this by just background radius, right? If we set the background radius large enough, then it will be a circle. So what I do is I extended the stack pane, we keep the type, and I just add an additional region. This is just for the icon, and I add this region to the stack pane. And because the stack pane, every child it has will be centered, this is already given, so we don't have to take care about centering the icons in the middle or something like that. And then I just add a specific style named icon to this region. And you see the region here is the same size as the stack pane, but it's transparent by default. And the stack pane itself, we will see, it has just a border radius and a fill and a stroke. And what we now add to the icon is a SVG path. So if you have SVG, it's a scalable vector graphics. And if you have something like Adobe Illustrator or other tools, graphical tools, you can mostly you can export something as a vector graphics as SVG. And this is what I did here, for example. I just draw the cross, exported it, took the path, the string, and just added as fx minus shape. And I said fx minus scale minus shape false because we don't want to have the shape scalable. It should always be the same size because these buttons are always the same size. So I add this, this shape, then we give it a fill, like background color, just a gray tone, and then we add just a rotation by 45 degrees, and then we have our cross. Right? This is everything you need to create this cross. So there's not really more involved here. And this can be whatever you like, because it's a scalable vector graphics. It's just one path. As long as it's one path, you can just have a string like, I don't know which size, but it's possible to do that. The problem with this is you can't use multiple colors. You can just use one color for this path. If you would like to have multiple colors in an SVG, then you really have to stack paths on top of each other. That is possible, but it's really, that's a little bit more tricky. For this stuff, this is all we need. So that means, yeah, that's what I said. If you have a vector drawing program, in this case I used Affinity Designer, which is really not that expensive, and it's pretty good. So I just draw the whole thing and exported the cross, and this is the pink string that you see there, and just took that, copy, paste into the CSS, and that's it. And that's pretty simple. This is also my advice. If you do graphical stuff, what I do, I draw it first. This is really, I don't code it first. I draw the whole thing in the vector graphics program, and then when I have it finished, because if you think about that, a vector graphics program is, in principle, something like a coding tool, because if you need to make changes, it's so easy. It's created to make changes to drawings. But if you start with coding, then you always have to try and error. You code it, you compile it, you run it, you see, okay, code, calc, this takes forever. In a drawing program, it's really easy to do that. So that's what I always do. Drawing, export, and then I go from the drawing and start coding. Okay, so this is now the window. We have, you see now, when I hover over it, you see that the little cross appears. And then I can also add, for example, a mouse listener with a pressed or clicked handler or something like that, and so I can also add functionality to this. So this is in principle our window edit. Another example would be in macOS, the drop-down box looks like this, the upper one, and the JavaFX drop-down box is the lower one, which is really not the same. If you would like to make look the same, you need a button where we have this little triangle on the lower one, and it should be this blue one. So this is, again, you can do this with the SVG and CSS. So we only would like to create this thing. It's pretty easy, because what we do is we just use a region, in this case for the arrows. This is really finally the SVG path. And then we use, what did I use here? Is it a stack pane? Yeah, it's just a stack pane. Because the stack pane is always great because it centers its content. So for stuff like this, it's perfect. And what you see here is the blue stuff, the blue dotted stuff here is the region where we put the arrows in later on. And the black dotted thing, the area around it, this is the stack pane. So let's start by shaping the stack pane, right? So what we do is we set the width and the height and fix it to 16 pixels, because that's the size of this box. And we set the background's inset to 0, and the border radius here, the background radius, it's 3.25 pixels. All this stuff you have to measure, and therefore you need a good screenshot tool. And then we fill that thing with a gradient. The gradient, again, we use the gradient because on top of the button we need a little highlight to make it pop out. You will find that everywhere. So that means this is the first layer of our button. And then what we then add, we just do add insets, right? Half a pixel. And then we add this, in this case, just white, first of all. And after that, we just fill it with the blue color, and then you see, on top, you see now the highlight. And this is the effect. So this is always the same. In all these things, you always see, if you would like to have something that pops out, it has a highlight on top. If you would like to have it like pushed in, then the highlight is on the button. This is always the same effect. And you see here already that the linear gradient goes from the light blue to the same blue as the content. And that leads to the fact that you only see the highlight on top. Then we add the drop shadow to that whole thing. And in the end, we just add the SVG path. I didn't really put the whole path in here, but that's what in the FX shape, on the lower left, that's where the whole shape comes in. And the size of these arrows is really defined by the padding that we see on top. I made that a little bit bolder. That defines, and therefore that whole SVG stuff makes sense, because with this, you can really make it smaller, make it wider, you can change the height and all that, and it will always render perfectly fine. So what we end up is this. You see it's a little bit different on the lower part. This is just a screenshot. It's not exactly the macOS style, but it's very close to it. And so you can do a lot of stuff with CSS if you know how to do it. It's a little bit of fiddling around, but once you're used to it, it's really powerful. Okay, so then the question is, when should you use CSS? Who's using CSS in applications? Oh, a lot. Oh, that's cool. So my advice is, because I'm not a big fan of CSS, so to be honest, I like to code this stuff. If you use standard controls, you definitely should use CSS, because they are all based on CSS. If your control inherits a standard control, same thing, right? Use CSS to style it. If it has an impact on many controls, like you create a library or something like that, and they rely on each other, or you extend your own stuff, then of course CSS is great, because changing one parameter will have an effect on all of them. If you code that, might be not that easy. If your environment is already using CSS, of course, then you should stick to CSS and not really say, no, my stuff don't use CSS, so then you should use it. Creating a library, I already mentioned, that makes it easy for people to change stuff afterwards, because they can just load a different CSS file to the application and make your controls look differently. So that's quite useful. If a customer would like to shape the application or customize it, of course you should use CSS. But back to the idea. So I told you I tried to create this desktop application, and I could talk for hours about that, but we don't have the time. So I created this stuff, and it's called GLUCOSTATUSFX. You can find it under that link. It's free. So everybody that has diabetes and uses a Night Scout server, that's the stuff, can use that. So it's just for visualizing the data. And now the interesting thing is, how close can we get? The left side is the Swift, or this original Swift application, and the right side is the JavaFX application. You see, the JavaFX application has a brighter header. This is the only thing that I really hate, because that shows it's not really a macOS application. It's different. And this is, I don't know why it is. In the former versions of JavaFX, it wasn't even possible to have a dark window. It didn't work at all. So, but with this version, with the current one in 1702, you have dark style, but then it's not really the original color. It's a little bit too bright. But you see, all the rest looks pretty much the same. I restyled the toggle buttons. That's on top of the stuff. It's in principle an HBox, where I just put in toggle buttons that I styled via CSS and a separator. Then these icons that you see, this is the SVG path. And because on Swift, I can use the symbol, there's a library from Apple that is called Symbols, and you can export each of that symbol as an SVG. So I just exported the stuff as SVG, and then used that in an SVG path in my app. So this is also possible. And the chart is implemented as a canvas. And then let's take a look at the settings, for example, because you see on the left side is again Swift, and on the right side, this is the JavaFX one. What I did, I created this switch control, which is exactly the same as the macOS one. And all the other stuff you see, it's a little bit different, but I'm pretty close to the original version with my JavaFX version. Right here, all the windows that I have. Okay, and this is the interesting part. On the left side, this is the tray icon. And if you take a closer look, you see that the left, it's the 79, what I'm talking about, this stuff. You see on the left side, this is more crisp. This is the Swift thing. On the right side, it's a little bit pixelated. The reason for that is that in Java, there's no easy way to do that. So not out of the box. In JavaFX, you can't do it. But there is a library. This is called FXTRAYICON. And this library makes use of AWT, and that means you have to take care about the event dispatch thread, because suddenly you are in Swing or AWT and the JavaFX application thread. So this is a little bit tricky, but this can handle images and put it on a system tray. And the problem is that Windows has different size, on macOS has different size, on Linux it only works on several distributions, so it doesn't work on Ubuntu at all, so it doesn't show up. That's a little bit of a pain in the butt, but that's how it is. But I was only building the stuff for Mac, so I didn't care. And I said it's only images, so you can already have the idea what I did. So what I did is I create a canvas. I draw the text and the arrow in the canvas. Then I take a snapshot of the canvas, convert the snapshot into a buffered image, and then I use the buffered image as a tray icon using that library. And that works quite well. So it's really, I wasn't sure when I started that, but I use it now on my other MacBook. I use that only, not the Swift version at all. Yeah, so like I said, display the image as a tray icon. It's really easy. You only have to be aware that you have to sync up the EDT and the FX application thread correctly, because this is a little bit tricky, because if you don't do it, you don't get any error message, but it just won't change. The code is running fine, but nothing's happening, so it's just like it didn't work. But if you really sync the threads, then everything's fine. Okay, so can I create the same map in JavaFX? Yes, I can, no problem. But what about web? Can I run the JavaFX application in the browser? I mean, without using any plugin? Yes, you can. I don't know if you heard about JPro. Anybody here? Except the guys over there? No? You should check that out, because that's an interesting concept. Yeah, the demo, I don't do a real demo, I just did screenshots, because you never know about the network. On the left side, this is my JavaFX application on the desktop. On the right side, it's Chrome, running the same application. It's really exactly the same. It's just running in the browser. And JPro makes that possible. And that's quite cool. It has some drawbacks, we come to that in a minute, but you can run your JavaFX application in the browser. And it's fast. I have even a game that runs in the browser. So, okay, you have some drawbacks, like there are no dialogues. The dialog should be an additional pane where you put all the content in, as you can see on the right side. That means it's not 100% the same code, so you have to tweak it a little bit, but it's really just a little bit. It's dialogues that doesn't really work like expected, and you don't have a system tray, of course. The same goes for this chart, right? And this, there's this artifact. This was from the screenshot tool. I don't know why I didn't get it. Same for this chart. And then, yeah, this is also everything the same. So you can run a JavaFX application in the browser. So the really advantages are the large part of the code is just the same. You don't have to do anything to make it happen, right? The performance is quite good. It depends on how good your code is, of course. I mean, you can mess up JavaFX if you like. It's not a big deal. The problem is the scene graph. People coming with the Swing experience, and don't really read through or understand how the scene graph works. They just put everything on the scene graph, creating nodes during runtime and all that, and then they mess up the whole system, and it gets slow, and then they blame it, and yeah, it's just because you don't know how it works, right? It's a different approach. So yeah, it's easy to start with for Java developers. It runs on nearly every HTML5 capable browser, and it's very close to the desktop system. You saw it's just the dialogues that don't really work the same way. And the idea is you run it in a Docker container, for example, because the problem is with this approach, what they do, they split the rendering, they put it into SVG in the browser, and the other stuff is running on the server. Okay, that might remind you on some time way back in the beginning of Java where we had some kind of stuff that was exactly like this. So, but the problem here is if you run it on the server and there's just one instance, that means if you started another browser, they share the variables, right? As soon as they are static, it can be an advantage, but it's probably a disadvantage. So there's not a lot of use cases for that, but you can really do that stuff, so, which is great. It supports dark and light mode, so that means if you switch the browser to dark mode, it will recognize and you can react to that. Disadvantages, yeah, you need a server cloud infrastructure to run that stuff on. You can run it locally, just for demo. You saw it was localhost 8080, so I just let it run on my machine. A multi-user setup is tricky to run because I already explained, it's like you run the exact desktop application on the server side and do the rendering in the browser, so there's not really multi-user capabilities. It's just one instance running there. So the Docker approach is probably the best, because then you just start it in enclosed environments. Yeah, dialogues are different. There's no accent color support for Mac, okay. So what about mobile? Who heard about GLUON here? Someone? Okay. So yeah, because you also can run the same application, the same on mobile devices like Android or iOS. And I just, again, have a little demo. So, and you might wonder that on the left side, it's not GLUCOSTATUS in this case, it's GlucoTracker. That was the first version I created. I told you I have 2 different programs. So on the left, this is the Swift version I did. And on the right, this is the exact desktop version, just in a different dimension. And yeah, so I have desktop style buttons. You see on the left side, it's just the blue gear. And on the right side, it looks like on the desktop, because it's the same application. You can restyle that for mobile, but I didn't do. The same as with the JPro stuff. So instead of having dialogues, you just put it in a window, but you see even in Swift, it looks like this. Yeah, full-size pane instead of dialogues. Desktop-size buttons, yeah, and here the same with the screenshot tool. I don't know why that happens, but okay. You don't see that stuff. I have it on my phone. If someone is interested, I can show it later after the session. Yes, all this stuff. And the settings, and this is also interesting because on Mac, the desktop sliders look like on the right side, except you have a desktop slider that has no tick marks. Then it looks like on the left side. And on iOS, all the sliders look like on the left. You always have this because you can better drag it with your finger. So this is the drawback here. So mine has just this small desktop kind of thing that you can better touch with the mouse. But everything else was the same. Again, large parts of the code you can reuse. The performance is not a problem at all. So it was a couple of years ago, but JavaFX on mobile is really fast. If you don't believe me, just come to our booth, Azure. It's directly around the corner, and I can show you on my phone. I have some demos there. It's easy to start with because it's just Java. It runs on iOS and Android, same code. And you can style it for each platform. You can style it differently if you like. It can be published on app stores, so that's all possible. So there's no reason not to do it. But it also has some disadvantages. So there's no real native UI. So that means if you would like to create a native-looking macOS app or iOS app, yeah, you have to style all the stuff on your own. There's no help at all. And for Android, it's similar, but the designers of GLUON, they decided to go with Android as the default platform. So it looks close to the original Android stuff. There's a problem with 24/7 apps. That's the reason why I don't really use it. Because with this, you can't, on Mac, on iOS, it's really tricky on an iPhone to create something that runs 24/7, always in the background. Because they have specific mechanisms to make sure that your app goes to sleep and then it wakes up just shortly, goes to sleep, and all these to save battery time. And this is, of course, not possible for this application because this is something that's only in Swift. You have no support for widgets. On iOS, we have widgets, and we have watch faces, no support. And sound is possible, but it's handled differently than on the desktop. Right? So that means you have to change the code definitely for this kind of stuff. No accent color support, no support for dark light mode. So it's also a little bit of a drawback. Oh, and no automatic locale detection, which is something, yeah, the problem is this stuff is pre-compiled. It's the native image. They use GraalVM to do that. And you can imagine that if you do that, you have to set the locale when you compile it. That means when you run it, you can't really change it anymore. That's a little bit of a problem for them at the moment. They are working on a solution, but at the moment you can't automatically detect the locale. You can set it in the app, but you can't auto-detect. So my tip, if you do something like that, what I do is I create a desktop branch, and then I create a branch for GLUON and a branch for JPro, and then I just do the modifications that I need for this kind of stuff. You will find it in the GLUCOSTATUSFX project on GitHub. You can see how it's structured. It has 3 branches like main, GLUON, and JPro, and you see the difference in the code. It's not that much. And because I started all of that, I thought, well, maybe I should create a little library that I called AppleFX that gives you the ability that comes with the controls that I already created, so that you don't have to create it on your own again. It doesn't have a lot of controls because I only created the stuff that I needed, and it supports bright mode and dark mode. And not even that, it also detects switching to bright mode and dark mode, and it also detects the accent color when you change it in Mac. So I have a little demo video here. On the right side, you see this is the settings in Mac. On the left side is just the demo window, and now I will change to another color, for example. And then you will see it takes some seconds. And what happens if I change the window, you will see that all the stuff that is blue becomes gray. This is something in macOS. I also implemented that to draw the attention to the right window. And you will see as soon as I move the mouse over to the right side and click somewhere, on the left side everything becomes gray. Now it should happen. Come on. Yeah, here you see. This is something that's implemented in macOS, that you follow the mouse. The stuff that's active has all the colors. It's not disabled. It's just, it has a different style. And you see I switched to pink, and so I implemented all the colors on macOS. So now we have all the controls in that color and can use that. But you saw it took some time, because what macOS does, it changes a specific file, like a properties file, and you can add a file system listener to that file, and as soon as the file changes, I can react on that and change the stuff. You also see when I changed to light mode, it took a couple of seconds for the program to react on that, but it can. So that means my application can just react on, if I switch it to another accent color, to dark mode or bright mode, it will detect it and will also change. And this is just a demo library, a demo application, but you can just use the library. It has these controls. They are all something like macOS button, macOS dropdown, macOS text field, and all this kind of stuff. All right, so this is this one. And then I have a few words about Canvas for you. Who's using Canvas? Just one. This is the best thing in JavaFX. Man. It's just one node on the scene graph. You will see why I really love that stuff. You have full control. It's fast. It's flexible. It's 99% compatible with HTML5 Canvas, which is great because you can just copy code from the web and it runs on your FX application. There are some disadvantages, of course. It is you don't have a direct interaction with shapes, because this is just one node on the scene graph. The mouse handler just reacts on changes on nodes. That means you can add a listener to this canvas node, but within the canvas node, everything you draw, you have to take care about that, right? So you have to add your own listeners, keep track of the position in your canvas, and then react on this stuff. Layout is your job, so there are no layout containers in HTML5 Canvas either, so it's like Swing, you just have to draw something. Cleanup is also your job, so you just have to clear the canvas before you do something, or if you can also clear up just areas, like dirty areas. Very much like in Swing, the stuff that we had there. It's not testable, of course not, because we can just really do clicking somewhere. It's not implemented like that, because it's just one node. And the content is not really stylable, but it is. So you can style it using stylable properties. So when to use it? If you have complex graphics, go with Canvas. Pixel-based graphics, you can only do in Canvas. There's no way around that. Performance, if you need performance, Canvas is the way to go. If you don't need interaction, just showing something, then go with Canvas. And if you need full control about the rendering, full, not really, you always depend on the scene graph, but at least you have some control. Or if you write games, then you should use Canvas. And if you do stuff on restricted devices like Raspberry Pi or IoT stuff, then Canvas is really good. I will show you why. So this is stuff I did, so just to show you what you can do with the Canvas. This is hard to do on a scene graph. right? So and this is not visible here, but there's also an overlay that gives you this LCD, crispy, crystal effect, and all these things. So this is a typical, and you don't need interaction. This is just showing something. Therefore, it's perfect, right? So then, or this kind of stuff, shape effects, right? If you would like to do something like that, not so easy on the scene graph. But in Canvas, pretty easy to do, because this is just two shapes, and I can just draw the mouse over it and then transform them, right? And I also change the color you see. Or this is the live calculated graph that's animated, and I just did the pixelation that you see. This is all drawn at runtime, so this is not really something that is like a movie. And this is not possible in the scene graph. Therefore, you need Canvas. Or stuff like that. It's from my chart library that I did. It's also using Canvas. That you can do on the scene graph. That's possible with paths. But the good thing is this is just one node on the scene graph. Or like this. I did that, I don't know, 3 years ago. This is just a game. And this is also running on the Canvas. This whole thing is just one node on the scene graph. And you see a lot of stuff is going on. And the performance is quite good. So that's not really slow. So, and I give you one example now. We saw the stuff that you in my application, and if you take a look at label, for example, it has 2 nodes on the scene graph. A button is also 2 nodes. A checkbox is already 3 nodes. If you have a radio button, it's also 3 nodes. The text field is 5, and now this is the good one. A combo box, 28 nodes on the scene graph. This is UC1 control. The scene graph has to handle 28 of it, right? So that when JavaFX came out, Oracle said, well, scene graph can handle up to 100,000 nodes, no problem at all. We did a test at that time. We just created a scene graph where we just put lines on it. It can handle a lot of lines. Then we just added a drop shadow to the lines, and that's it. Not even 3,000 of these have been able to render fastly with animations. It didn't just work. So that means you have to take care about the numbers on the scene graph. This is something for big applications, and you suffer from performance issues. Count the numbers on your scene graph and do a check. That's really important. This is one example from my application, and I would just like to focus on this part. Right? It looks easy. This is, if you analyze it, it's a matrix. So probably you put a grid pane there, then you add just labels, right? And then you style them with CSS, which are the colorful rectangles. And if you do that, then you end up, you see on the left side, the whole thing is implemented in Canvas. It's 1 node. On the right side, it's 87 nodes for this control. And this is probably, you know, something like that. It's a calendar. So that if you have an application where you have multiple of these months, then the whole nodes stack up, and you have no idea because it looks so simple. And this is something you have to keep in mind. So for this kind of stuff, Canvas is really powerful. And if you suffer from performance issues, you really should think about that, using a Canvas instead. Okay, so this one control saved me 68 nodes on my scene graph. It doesn't really sound that a lot, but if you have an IoT device, they are not that powerful. A Raspberry Pi can maybe handle up to 1,000 nodes, maybe, if you're lucky. And in this case, you really have to count these nodes. Okay, some tips about performance. I mean, you should know that, but I thought it makes sense. You should avoid deeply nested layout structures. They just suck in JavaFX, so it can get slow. Reduce the number of nodes if possible. Avoid using effects. If it's not needed, don't do it. And if you use effects like drop shadows, then apply them to a group and not to each node. This is a huge performance increase. If you would like to have a drop shadow on all of your controls, for example, then just put them all in a group, apply the shadow once to the group, instead of to each button or whatever. So that's really a big hit in performance. You should keep track of the dirty state. When you override layout children, some people do that. The layout children will be called on each CSS style run. Even if your control is not affected, it will execute this method. So that means if nothing changed in your control, then you should somehow keep track on your dirty state of your control. If it's not dirty, then just don't execute your code in layout children. This is something that helps too. Use Canvas if needed. Cache nodes before do animations, right? If you animate nodes over your scene graph, you should cache them first, because what JavaFX does, it creates a snapshot, animates the image, and release the image again to the nodes, and that helps. Be aware of the FX application thread. It's like Swing EDT. Same goes with the JavaFX. Avoid inlining CSS, not a good idea. Know your target platform. If you develop something for a Mac, which is really powerful, or a Windows machine, or for a Raspberry Pi, there's really a huge difference. The same application will run, but if it's not designed for a Pi, it will probably suck. Avoid using transparent stages if possible. I showed you in the beginning, this is really something that can have an impact. And you should use set manage true false in combination with set visible true false. So that means if you have parts of your scene graph that you don't show because you just show them sometimes, then before you hide them, just say set managed false. That means for the scene graph, okay, I won't do anything with this part of the code. When you make it visible again, then you set managed true. So with this, the scene graph, you can make sure that the scene graph only renders the stuff that's visible to keep the numbers of nodes as low as possible. So, and with this, I'm done.